So today I'm speaking with Massimo Pigliucci, a practicing Stoic. Massimo has doctorates in a wide range of fields: genetics, biology, and philosophy of science. He's taught ecology and evolution, and then, as he'll explain, had a road to Damascus moment. And he's subsequently written 2 books, How to Be a Stoic and Live Like a Stoic, and edited the collection How to Live a Good Life with Daniel Kaufman and Skye Cleary, to which he contributed a chapter on Stoicism. So, Massimo, welcome to Shrink Wrap Radio.
It's a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Well, I wanted to start off with, if you could just explain a little bit of your background, how it came to be that you moved into a different field, because you're still teaching at university level, but you've changed over from biology to philosophy, essentially.
Yes. Well, it was a classic midlife crisis, which, however, took an unusual turn to some extent. So I was, as you say, an evolutionary biologist for many years, and I'd gone through the standard academic career. So, assistant professor, associate professor. I had a lab that was doing research on gene-environment interactions. And how organisms respond to different environmental conditions, and that was fine. It was a lot of fun. But then at some point, in my early 40s, and I said, okay, do I really want to do this for the next 30 years or something? I need to do something different. Now, this is not unusual. A lot of academics reach a point in their career where they say, okay, let me look somewhere else and see what else I can do. The only difference is that I looked a little further upfield than most of my colleagues. Instead of looking into a similar field in biology, let's say ecology or molecular biology or something like that, because of a series of circumstances, and because I always had a background interest in philosophy anyway, I decided to enroll in the PhD program at the university where I was at that point, in the University of Tennessee in Knoxville. And I had this wonderful friend who became my mentor, Jonathan Kaplan. And for 3 years, it was a lot of fun because I was running the lab and teaching in the morning or early afternoon, then crossing campus and taking classes in the evening, and then writing my dissertation during the weekends, which essentially meant that for 3 years I had no life outside of campus for all effective purposes.
You were in lockdown.
I was definitely in lockdown, self-imposed for sure. So then what happened, but the original idea was never actually to shift fields completely. My plan was to keep doing biology and just shift the balance between the two, keep writing in philosophy of science. That was my field of choice, in particular philosophy of biology, and because I thought it was very complementary with my science. But then years later, I moved to Stony Brook University on Long Island as a biologist. And it was a great place to be, an excellent department of ecology and evolution, except that it was very close to New York City. And at some point I said, I am tired of suburban life, so I need to move to New York. I grew up in Rome, in a big city, so I feel always more comfortable in a big city. So I moved to New York and I started commuting out to Stony Brook. That took about 2 hours by train each way. So after a while, that became a little bit hard, a little untenable. So I thought, okay, let's look for a job in the city. But lots of people want to work as academics in New York City, especially, and it's particularly difficult to find a job at a higher rank as a full professor. So I said to myself, okay, you're going to apply to whatever job comes out. If it's biology, it's biology. If it's philosophy, it's philosophy. Turns out the first one that came out was at the City University of New York in philosophy. I applied. Surprisingly, they hired me, and so that was it. That was the shift. That was a shift, and that ever since, this was 7 years ago, I've become a philosopher of science.
And I remember, I think I first came across you, it must have been 4 or 5 years ago. And I went on Stoic Week as a result of listening to you talk about having had an experience on Stoic
Yes.
Week. And I did that too. I very much enjoyed the conversations that you had with both Daniel Kaufman and more recently with Robert Wright.
Yes.
And you also talked with Daniel Finker about philosophical counselling, which we'll get
Correct.
to a little bit later. But first of all, as Stoicism is the topic of the day, if you could just give us a little bit of a brief outline, because I think many people might have an assumption that this is, it's very much an ancient tradition, that it's a philosophy that's maybe a little bit abstract, but it is something that has incredible practical wisdom. And we'll move into the specifics about the time we're in, but just a broad brushstroke of Stoicism, if you don't mind.
Yeah, it is an ancient Greek and Roman philosophy. It started out around 300 BCE in Athens, established by a guy named Zeno of Citium. And it is very much practical. In fact, the Stoics were adamant that if you're just studying the theory, you're just studying, philosophy in general, logic or something, without a view toward actually changing your life and improving your life, then you're just wasting your time. You're just doing navel gazing and you're wasting your time. So Stoicism is very much practical philosophy. It's not, of course, unique from that perspective. I actually tend to think of Stoicism as the Western equivalent of Buddhism or Taoism or Confucianism, these kind of very practical philosophies where, of course, there is a theory behind it because they are philosophies after all. It's not like, just make up and make it up as you go. But the theory is always very tightly connected with the practice. In a sense, if you think about it, I mean, you mentioned the book with How to Live a Good Life with Kaufman and Skye Cleary that we co-edited. That book has 15 chapters, each one of which is written by somebody who practices and not just studies a particular philosophy or religion. And I make the point in the introduction to that book that there is, in fact, not much of a difference between philosophies of life and religions. They work in pretty much in the same way, and they typically have 2 or 3 essential components. They all have a metaphysics, which is an account of how the world works. So if you're a Christian, for instance, the world was created by a loving and omnipotent God, and so on and so forth. If you are a Stoic, on the other hand, the world is it's just nature. God is nature, and it's the web of cause and effect. The Stoics are very materialists from that perspective, and so on. The second component is the ethics. That is an account of how you should behave in the world, particularly behave toward others, right? So if you're a Christian, you're supposed to use either the Old Testament, but especially the New Testament as models. You're supposed to look at the life of Jesus as a model for ethical behavior. If you are a Buddhist, you will look at the life of Buddha as an ethical behavior. And if you are a Stoic, you look at the lives of some Stoics and of what they tell you about how to live your life. And then the third component, which is often there, not always, is a set of practices. I mean, we don't think of Christianity as coming with a set of practices, but it does. When you go to church, for instance, you're practicing Christianity. When you pray, you're practicing Christianity. When you read the Gospels and you reflect on passages from what Jesus said, you're practicing. And then, of course, there's the implementation of that practice in your day-to-day interactions with other people. You're supposed to behave in a certain way. So the same goes for Buddhism. Meditation is a type of Buddhist practice, of course. The Buddhists also read texts and reflect on them and so on and so forth. And the same goes for the Stoics. The Stoics read what other Stoics have written, and they have a number of meditation exercises. And then all of this is supposed to come together into actually shaping your life. It's a philosophy or a religion you can think of it as a sort of a compass to navigate your life more efficiently, better, and especially more morally, more ethically.
It seems to me that there's actually quite a considerable crossover with psychology. And of course, this podcast is essentially many of the listeners are psychologists in practice or in training. And it seems to me that the idea of an ethics, of a guide to living the good life, has a lot of crossover with psychological practices as well.
Yes, it's not by coincidence, for instance, that Stoicism influenced the early version of cognitive behavioral therapy. Albert Ellis and his rational emotive behavior therapy, Beck and so on. So some of the early practitioners of CBT were directly inspired by the Stoics. They actually write about it. They say, that the basic idea came from people like Marcus Aurelius and Epictetus. And that doesn't surprise me because the Stoics had a very developed, theory of psychology. Of course, they were writing 2,000 years ago, so their psychology was based on intuitions about human behavior and observations. They were careful observers of human behavior. Mm-hmm. Today, we do things in a more systematized thing, experimentally and so on and so forth. But there is a continuity between the two traditions for sure. But the major difference, I would think, although even that one is a fuzzy one, is that, let's say in CBT, you go to a CBT practitioner because you have a specific problem, phobia, or you're depressed, or whatever it is. And, the therapist will try to help you over a short period of time. This is not supposed to be a lifelong sort of commitment,
No.
and it is specific to a particular problem. In the case of philosophy, on the other hand, it is a lifelong commitment, and it is not specific to a particular problem. It tends to be about life in general. How do you live your life, and what your priorities are, etc. But as I said, there is quite a bit of overlap, because if you think about the way Albert Ellis especially structured his rational emotive behavior therapy, there are a lot of overt philosophical components into that practice. So,
and one of the things I was in the current moment, when there's a great deal of anxiety and a great deal of fear around, it seems to me that there are actually quite a lot of elements of Stoicism that might be able to help people to come to terms with their own anxiety, or offer tips to clients perhaps who are dealing with anxiety and stress. One of the aspects, and I think this probably does have a direct link with CBT, is the dichotomy of control. If you could explain that.
Right, that is a fundamental notion in Stoicism, which actually goes back right at the beginning of the philosophy with Zeno of Citium, but it's most famously articulated by Epictetus, who was a early second century Stoic that practiced in Rome and then in northwestern Greece. And the dichotomy of control essentially says very simply that certain things are up to us and other things are not up to us, meaning that for certain things, the buck stops with us. We have the last word. Control is a little bit of a misleading word. I know this is the term that it's now used nowadays, and so we're going to stick with it. But it does lend itself to misunderstandings, because typically the dichotomy of control is presented as in this manner, that some things are under your control, other things are not under your control. And then people immediately say, well, but there are some things in between. Right? There are some things that I can influence, but not completely control. And that is absolutely true, except that if you think about it, every single thing that you can influence itself breaks down into two components, one that you control and the other that you don't control. So let me give you a practical example. Let's say that I'm to go for a job interview, right? And obviously I want the job, and I'm preparing for the job, etc. Well, the Stoic would ask himself, so what is it in this particular situation that is under my control, and what is not under my control? Right? Under my control is preparing, do my best to prepare for the interview, put together the best resume that I can, maybe rehearse before I go actually for the interview, all these kind of things. Those are completely up to me, meaning that it's not like somebody else can do it for me, or can make those kind of decisions for me. I have to do it. But then the outcome of the actual interview depends on a bunch of other factors, not just on how you prepare yourself, but let's say on the interviewer himself. Maybe he got, maybe he was stressed that morning, he got up on the wrong side of the bed, so to speak, and he's in a bad mood. Or maybe there are other people who are actually objectively better better suited for that job than you are, and so you got competition, and so on and so forth. All of those things are really outside of your control. You don't influence the mood of the interviewer. You don't influence who is going to apply for the job, etc. So the outcome is something that, of course, depends on both external factors and internal ones. And so in that sense, your focus on internal factors obviously can influence the outcome, because the better you prepare, the more chances you have that you're going to get the job. But it does help conceptually to distinguish those two things sharply, because then you can focus on what is actually up to you, and not start worrying about things that are not under your control and about which you can't do anything.
And in fact, I don't want to turn this into a personal philosophical advice session, but it has totally helped me. I'm a football journalist, and all my work has been cut for the foreseeable future. I don't know when I'm going to earn any money again, so I have this intense feeling of overwhelm. Then there's the situation outside where you can't buy toilet roll in England, and and other things like that. So there's all this stuff going on, and I feel a panic response. I feel that panic response, but I I tried to keep to the Stoic principles, and I can call my mortgage provider and get a delay. I can stop pension contributions. The Inland Revenue have very kindly said that I can have delay on when I'm paying my tax. I can cut my expenditure. I can keep on washing my hands. I can consider that I've got books that I can tear up if I run out of toilet. So that there's a great deal on a practical level that
yes.
And taking that control also seems to have a psychological impact on how you feel, because you have a sense of competency, I think.
Correct. I mean, it is a fundamental of human psychology that we feel better, less anxious when we feel that we are in control of a situation. And the mistake from a Stoic perspective is that we try to get control over things that we don't control. And that's where the anxiety isn't going to go away, because you're going to try to get a hold of things that you actually are not up to you. But if you do focus, as you were just saying, on the often surprisingly many things that you can actually, in fact, act on, then you feel better, because you say, well, at least I'm doing something. Now, that said, there's a couple of caveats here, because that often come up with these kind of discussions. So, number one, obviously, this does not guarantee an outcome, right? Or the outcome that you want. I mean, you can do all you want, for instance, to prepare well for the interview, and you still fail the interview, not get the job. This is called life. And being an adult means that we accept from the get-go, right? And in fact, this is a major point in Stoicism, that we should always remind ourselves, if necessary, literally in writing, I do a philosophical journaling almost every day. Or repeating to yourself as a mantra when you are facing a particular situation. It's like, some things are up to me, other things are not up to me. That means that I may not succeed. It's not. But the nice sort of complement to that is that if I don't succeed, but I've actually done my best, I've done everything I could, then I can't blame myself for anything. If I did everything I could and it didn't work out the way I wanted, well, as I said, that's called life, and you just move on and wait for the next challenge. So the first caveat there is, of course, there is no guarantee that you're going to actually achieve what you want. That would be magic. It wouldn't be philosophy, right? If I provided you with a way to always succeed at what you want, then it's like, well, that's magic. Okay, it's not philosophy. Unless, of course, you are so well trained as a Stoic. That was what Epictetus was telling his students. If you really train yourself seriously, after a while, after years of practice, you actually internalize this notion that the only things you should desire are your own right judgments and right actions, not the outcomes. In that case, you're guaranteed to actually be always successful, because those are in fact up to you. But in terms of outcomes, obviously, the situation is such that sometimes you win, sometimes you lose. That's one thing. The other caveat, because it's a question that comes up often in these situations, like somebody tells me, well, but I practice the economy of control. I do my philosophical journaling and all that, and I still feel anxious. Well, sure. Again, this is not a magic pill. It's we unfortunately seem to, especially in the 21st century, late 20th, early 21st century, and especially in American society, we tend to sort of want the magic bullet. In fact, the phrase "magic bullet" does not exist in Italian, for instance. It's, as far as I can tell, it's an American thing. We don't even think about it in those terms. There is no magic bullet, and of course, you might still be anxious. You might still have, worries and so on and so forth, even though you practice, you do your best. But the question is this thing helping you? Is the anxiety lowering a little bit? If you do it for weeks at a time, months at a time, and then years at a time, does it get better? And the report that we have from many people who we're following, and by we, I mean the Modern Stoicism organization, it looks like it does, in fact, help, just in the way in which CBT helps. But CBT equally does not guarantee you an outcome. It doesn't guarantee you that you're going to be free of your anxiety. It doesn't guarantee you that you're going to, 2 weeks after you start practicing, you're done with it. Again, let's be adults about it. It's like, there are limits to what a philosophy or a therapy can do. But if in fact it can help, then why not? Also, what's the alternative? If you just want to indulge in despair and depression, yeah, go ahead, but that's not going to be very helpful.
One of the other aspects that I thought that when I was reading yesterday, it struck me as incredibly helpful. This was, the sense that the Stoics weren't big on sort of talking a lot about things. And there was a sense that they would only speak out when they were sure of not just the validity of something, but the pro-social nature of what they were saying. Because it is a very pro-social philosophy, isn't it? And I thought that, I mean, at the moment, I don't know if you've seen it, there's something that's been doing the rounds on Facebook, a post that's meant to come from Stanford Health Center, someone on the board of Stanford Health Center, with all this information about coronavirus, which isn't, it's a hoax. And so people feeling fear and feeling nervous of forwarding this thing onto each other, which has, you know, not at all useful information. And it seems to me that a lot in the practice of Stoicism does suggest that, you know, there is a seeking for truth and a following of logic, and maybe those aspects of looking at life in that way could be helpful in terms of preventing the spread of panic and fear and false information.
Yes, so I wrote an article recently about sort of Stoic approach to the COVID-19 situation, and I think it's helpful at two levels. First of all, because it actually does have a number of practical suggestions, which are evidence-based, science-based. But more broadly, it's a good explanation, I think, or a clear explanation of how the Stoic system works. So Stoicism, as I said, it's a philosophy, it's a philosophical system, so it has components. In particular, it has three components that are supposed to interact with each other. What the Stoics call the physics, the logic, and the ethics. Now, all those three terms need to be understood in a much broader sense than the English words, the current English words. Physics, for instance, doesn't mean that we're studying quantum mechanics, as interesting as that is. It means, physics really means all of the natural sciences as well as metaphysics. So it's that account of how the world works that I was talking about earlier. Logic, it's not just about formal logic and, you know, logical fallacies and things like that, although it does include that. It's anything that has to do with improving human reasoning, okay? Anything that helps improving human reasoning. And ethics is not just understood in terms of, you know, what is the right thing to do or what is the wrong thing to do. Is this action right or wrong or something like that? But it literally is the study of how to live your life. Now, according to the Stoics, ethics should be informed by sound logic and sound physics, meaning that in order to figure out how you live your life to the best abilities of a human being, you have to reason correctly, or as correctly as possible, and you have to know the facts as much as possible. You have to know how things work. So in the case, for instance, of the COVID-19 pandemics, well, the physics will tell you, inform yourself, but inform yourself from reliable sources, not from, so I tell my students, for instance, I'm teaching this semester a course on the science and philosophy of happiness. And of course, we moved everything online now. So in fact, to Thursday, I'm going to be doing the first fully online lecture for the course. And one of the things that I told immediately to my students is, don't pay any attention, quit social media if you can. Don't pay any attention to Facebook, Twitter, and all that sort of stuff. It's true that there is some good information there. It's not like it's not all bad, but it is so much garbage. The ratio of garbage to good information is so high that it's like you're just going to scare yourself and get into anxiety. Just quit it. I said also, frankly, if I were you, I wouldn't pay much attention to either the standard news, certainly not as much as people do. You don't need a 5-minute to 5-minute update on the pandemics. If you read maybe one article or you listen to 5 minutes on the radio a day, that's plenty, because there's not a lot of actionable information. No. A lot of what you hear in the news is stuff you can't do anything about. Oh, the markets are plummeting. What am I supposed to do about that? Nothing. So now I'm just going to worry about my retirement account, right? Why should I worry about my retirement account? It's not that I can do anything about it. I can't take the money out. It's there. So whatever is going to be left after this mess is over, then we'll deal with it. But right now, to just follow the market every up and down, minute by minute, just that's not helpful. Even when it is, in fact, good information, it's just not helpful. So the Stoics would say, inform yourself, but only about when it is appropriate and from good sources, and then think. Reason about what it is that you learn. Right? So ask yourself, okay, out of all of this, what kinds of things can I actually do in order to improve my life, in order to minimize the damage of whatever the situation is. Those are the things we should concern about. Everything else, shut it out. Because it's like, it's not only it's not helpful, it's actually probably arguably harmful. Right? So you want to use social media, new technologies, great. So I just had a conversation this morning with via email with a number of friends, and we're starting to do virtual aperitivo. So aperitivo is the Italian word for, you get together for a drink and an appetizer.
Yes,
At a
yes.
bar. Well, bars are all closed, restaurants are closed, so you can't do that. So what we decided is to use, technology like Skype, Zoom, things like that, and we'll just for an hour an evening we can just open up this stuff and cheer each other, chat, have a look at each other, because people have a tendency, of course, these days to just talk by text messaging, and that's great for keeping in touch. But it's important to actually see other people,
Yes,
live and interact and talk to other people. So there is a very good use of technology that you can do, given this situation. But people tend to focus, unfortunately, on the stuff that either it's not useful or in fact it's harmful, and that's not good. Just think differently, retrain yourself, thinking differently, act differently from what you're used to, and your life will be better.
We were talking about people being in a sort of isolated situation, and I don't know whether this comes through Stoicism. I know that the Greeks were quite in on physical fitness, and Seneca uses a lot of, and Epictetus as well. I think they use a lot of analogies between physical training and mental training. So some of the psychologists and so forth are saying things like, well, it would be good if you are stuck in home to do something like yoga in your home, or you can do HIIT sessions online. Do the Stoics have any advice on the physicality of life as well as on the way of thinking about life?
Yeah, so you're right. There's often an analogy that in Stoicism between caring for your character or for your soul, if you want to put it that way, on the one hand, and going to the doctor, caring for your body, or going to the gym and caring for your body that way. Some of the Stoics actually give specific advice. Musonius Rufus, for instance, was Epictetus' teacher. He was one of the most famous first century Stoics in Rome. And he actually has, unfortunately, we only have a few essays that are left on him, a few fragments, but he does have very specific advice on things, not only, something about what to eat and how to eat, and even how do you cut your beard, and it gets pretty specific. Of course, we don't need to follow the advice that the specific advice is given by people who lived 2,000 years ago in a very different kind of social setting. I mean, that's one of the objections that I often get about. So, why should we care about what people said 2,000 years ago? We live in a different society. We do, and so the specifics need to be updated, obviously. Updated with what? With the best science, with the best understanding that we have of how things work, and that's exactly how the Stoics would have done it, because they were following the best science and the best understanding of the time. But the reason that Stoicism is still, and I want to go back to the exercise specifically in a minute, but the reason that Stoicism is still relevant today is the same one that Buddhism is relevant, or Christianity is relevant. Human nature hasn't changed. The specifics are different. Yes, now we live in a society where you and I can talk across the ocean in real time, and Epictetus would have been stunned by anything like that, right? But in fact, you and I probably have similar fears and desires and joys and sorrows and so on and so forth to the people that Epictetus knew. We still want the same things. We still don't want, we still recoil from the same things. We still struggle for the same kind of things. That's why philosophies and religions have such a lasting power. Notice that we don't actually study, let's say, Aristotle's physics anymore. That's because the physics or Aristotle's biology, we studied as a sort of historical thing, but no biologist would actually use Aristotle's biology in their laboratory work. Yeah. On the other hand, Aristotle's ethics is still very much pertinent to what we're doing today. So back to the physical exercise. Yeah. So the Stoics thought that you have to take care of your body in a non-obsessive way. So you shouldn't be your body shouldn't be the major care that you have. It shouldn't be you shouldn't be obsessed about things. Why? Because the body should be maintained so that you can actually live your life. That's the point. It's instrumental. Right? Your body is instrumental to your life. if you have a healthy body, you'll have a healthy mind, and you will be able to do what you like in life more likely than not. And that's it. So they actually explicitly say, Epictetus explicitly says, don't just go to the gym every day, 3 times a day, or, don't go obsessed with it, because otherwise you're using a lot of your energy for the wrong priorities. But do take care of your body. Do take care of your health, because your mind is part of your body. The Stoics were definitely not, as I said, materialists. They didn't think that the mind was somehow different from the body. The mind is located inside the body, and it's a result of what the body does. In particular, of course, as we know today, what the brain does. And so you want to take care of both your brain and your body. So you want to eat healthy. You want to exercise. Yes. What we're doing with my wife here, for instance, my luck is that she's actually a yoga instructor, among other things. So she's very good at this kind of stuff. Yes, that comes handy. But we do, we improvise. So we have a few things here at home that we can use for working out. We live in an apartment complex that is 16 floors. And so we go up and down the stairs. We have a built-in, stairmaster, basically. In the apartment building. So you can do this, and if you do it regularly every day, you will actually not feel that much of a negative effect, even from a prolonged period in which you cannot get to the gym, you cannot go outside or do these kind of things. The same with food. I mean, yes, we are looking at some level of scarcity. In the United States here, there's still not a big problem. There are a few things that are becoming scarce, like toilet paper, for instance, and also for some reason frozen vegetables. I don't know exactly why, but the rest is even fresh produce you can still find. And so focus there too. Think about what you're doing. What is it that you're eating? Just because there's a pandemic outside, that's not a good reason to eat fries every day. It's like you want to still maintain your body and your mind in the best possible shape, which means making the right choices, even more so, arguably, than under normal circumstances, precisely because you are already under stress, you are already limited in what you can do, so you need to make the best decisions that you can under the circumstances.
And in light of that, I was thinking, I think is it an Epictetus quote where he's imagining going to the baths and the things that could annoy you going to the baths. And I was thinking of that when I, went into the supermarket today, and, I was thinking, well, the things that are going to stress me out are seeing these empty shelves and then starting to think, oh my God, what if I can never buy these products again?
Right.
And they're very clear on this idea of kind of creating a sort of bulwark in advance to protect your equanimity from circumstance.
That's right. And the notion of doing things in advance, practicing and training in advance is in fact crucial. I mean, sometimes I hear people tell me, I never heard of Stoicism, but now I started practicing and it's not working but I say, well, you're practicing in the middle of an emergency. And of course it's going to take more time. You're not prepared. It's like, to use an analogy that Epictetus does use, actually Marcus Aurelius used, the Roman emperor who was also a Stoic. Imagine that you jump into a ring with a boxer and you've never practiced boxing before. This is not a good situation. You're going to get pummeled. You can't say, well, let me practice now since now I have a fight. No, you practice before the fight. You don't fight. You don't practice at the fight. Now, that said, if you didn't practice before and you find yourself in the middle of a crisis, and this is the time that you actually want to pick up Stoicism, well, it's still going to be useful. I think it's going to be more useful than not doing it. But you have to realize that basically you are putting yourself in a situation where you're not prepared. Let's take, for instance, the economy of control. Or the standard exercise of writing your personal philosophical diary, which is meant to be a way for you to reflect on what you've done correctly, what you've done incorrectly, learn from your experiences, etc. Well, if you've never done it before and you just start now in the middle of pandemics, it may take some time before you actually feel good about it. It may take some time before you start sort of internalizing things. I mean, I've been practicing for years. And I can tell you that it does get better. And in my case, it actually got better very quickly. In a matter of weeks, I started seeing some improvement in my outlook on things. And then months, in a few months, I already got to a pretty decent level, what I consider a pretty decent level of sort of mastering of the techniques. But even so, several years later, I do still occasionally still get upset. I still get angry at some things, even though the Stoics tell you that anger is a wasted emotion because it's not helpful at all. But I catch myself much more rapidly, and it goes down. It goes back to a normal situation much more rapidly than it would have otherwise.
A resilience. Oh, you mentioned anger. I was recently listening to on Audible to Martha Nussbaum's book on anger, where she talks about the Stoics. And I wasn't going to bring up anger so much as her criticism with the Stoics is something that I think many people have with both the Stoics and with Buddhists, the sense that that there isn't enough in attachment or pro-social feeling, and I did notice that in this book, and I can't recall it now, you had specifically brought out a quote from someone who I hadn't heard of before about the circles of caring. And at this moment, it is quite noticeable in England. There are a lot of mutual aid groups that are forming up with people volunteering to help elderly people who might have to self-isolate to collect their to collect their shopping and things like that. We might see an increase in that. And is there anything that Stoicism could guide us in the wisdom of actually thinking a little bit outside ourselves right now?
Yeah, no, absolutely. In fact, this is a great question. Let me address both parts of it: the criticism about anger and then the expanding circles. So the guy you're thinking of is Hierocles, who was a 2nd century Stoic, and he came up with this really nice analogy of he says, you should think of the social environment in which you live with you at the center, because you are yourself, right? So we are all our own centers, but then outside of you there is your families, and then outside of that is your friends, and then people that live in the same city, and then people live in the same country, and then eventually humanity at large. And Hierocles said, what you should try to do is to try to contract, in a sense, these circles, getting closer and closer to you. Think of complete strangers as if they were friends. Think of friends as if they are family, and think of family as if they were yourself, right?
Oh, that's quite beautiful.
Yeah, so this is very much in line with the Stoic notion of cosmopolitanism. The Stoics were the very first among, together with their cousins, the Cynics. Another word, by the way, that doesn't mean today what it meant at the time.
Like Epicurean really, as well.
Epicurean,
yeah.
Exactly. That's right, like Epicurean. It's actually kind of funny that all those 3 words, Epicurean, Stoic, and Cynic, they're still very much in our vocabulary, but they're all distortions of the original philosophies. But the notion of cosmopolitanism is important in Stoicism because the whole point of a good human life, what the Stoics and the ancient Greeks in general called the eudaimonic life. Eudaimonia is the life worth living, in a sense. Okay? And the whole point of a eudaimonic life is, in fact, for the Stoics in particular, to use reason in order to improve social living. And the reason for that, they came up with this. They had this famous motto that said, "Live according to nature." We should live according to nature. And what does that mean? It doesn't mean that whatever is natural, it's good for you, because that's obviously false. Poisonous mushrooms are natural, but they're not good for you, I guarantee you. So that's not what it means. It also doesn't mean that we should all strip naked and rush into the forest and hug trees. Although
obviously that's a shame.
Right, that's a shame. But it's fine if you want to do it. There's no problem there. But that's not what it means. What it does mean is this: the Stoics thought that fundamentally, what distinguishes human beings from other living organisms is that we are highly social, incredibly social, much more social than any other organism on Earth, except for social insects. But social insects might lack the second component of fundamental to human nature, according to the Stoics, which is the ability to reason, to apply reason to solve problems. And so they thought that because it is so natural for us to be pro-social, and it's so natural for us to think about stuff, to reason about things, then the most fulfilling kind of human life that you can imagine is, in fact, one when you use your mind, your brain, in order to help others, to be pro-social. So very much Stoicism is into helping others. That's the whole point, in a sense, of the philosophy. Your life is better if you help others. And incidentally, the Stoics thought, quite reasonably, I think, that if you help others, indirectly you help yourself, because you live in a better society where people are more willing to cooperate and more willing to help, to be, they're more trustworthy and so on and so forth. And there is actually research, evidence from modern research that shows that that's exactly the case. The societies where people are more happy are societies where people are more feel that others are trustworthy, where they feel engaged with others and so on.
And isn't there also research suggesting that people who do volunteer, they get a burst of positive feeling as well. Absolutely. Through those actions as well? Absolutely.
I mean, we are often told that, you should look after yourself and you should think about yourself and all. But the reality is that, empirically speaking, that people have a better life and in fact a longer life if they are pro-social, if they constantly engage, if they continuously and persistently engage in the pro-social behavior. Now let me go back to the anger stuff, because that's one of the things that is often brought up even by serious philosophers like Martha Nussbaum, and I don't understand why it is such a widespread incomprehension of the philosophy, but let me try to clarify. So the Stoics thought that we have a range of emotions, some of which are disruptive, they're not good for us, and some of which are actually positive, they're good for us. Okay? So they put anger, fear, hatred into the first category, and they put love, joy, and a sense of justice into the second category. And contrary to the apparently widespread sort of assumption, Stoicism is not about suppressing emotion. It is about moving your emotional spectrum away from the negative stuff and toward the positive stuff. Now, why is anger a negative thing? Because anger overrides reason. When you act on the basis of anger, you're acting irrationally. And so the Stoics would say, the problem with that is that even if your anger is justified, maybe you're reacting to an injustice or something has been done that is not right. Even if it is justified, if you act on the basis of anger, you're very likely going to be regretting it, because you're going to act irrational. You're going to act in a way that it's either overreaction or a bad way of dealing with the situation. What you should do is to disengage from the situation, what modern psychologists call cognitive distancing. It's just like take a break. Right? Seneca, the first century Roman Stoic, who was advisor to the Emperor Nero, explicitly says, you should count the alphabet, you should recite the alphabet, or count to 20, or go out for a walk, or do anything that sort of allows you to calm down. You cannot control anger. In fact, the Stoics are very clear. You don't suppress anger. You just disengage, right? You let it let off steam without being involved in the actual situation. Once that you're calm, then you go back and think about it and say, okay, wait a minute, what is it that made me so upset about this thing? And it will turn out, Seneca says, that sometimes you had a good reason, but now that you're calm, you can act on that reason appropriately. And in fact, he says, the majority of times you'll find out that you didn't have a good reason to get upset. He actually goes through a list of things. He says, so ask yourself, so this person upset you, right? So you got angry at this person. Well, was he a child? If he was a child, it's not his fault. So why are you getting upset? Was he an animal? Because you get upset with animals as well, right? Well, it's an animal. It doesn't reason. So why are you getting upset about it? Is it an inanimate object? Like people that get upset at their computers when they don't work, or their cars or something like that. It's like, what are you doing? Why are you getting upset with an inanimate object? They're not going to do it. Okay, then maybe it was a friend. Well, then if it was a friend, he probably actually meant well. And perhaps he was just, didn't express himself well. So maybe you need to give him a second chance. Was it an enemy? Well, then why are you surprised? Of course, enemies are going to try to hurt you. So let's just go through these scenarios. And at the end, it says, probably there's not much reason for you to get upset. What you do need to do is to, as I said, disengage and then look at the situation and see what is it I can do. But that is always a coupled in Stoicism with the mindful cultivation of positive emotions. We should cultivate love and joy and a sense of well-being with others and a sense of community. All those kind of things need to be actually actively cultivated. And so that's the notion, not suppressing emotion, just moving your emotional spectrum toward a more positive situation.
And that does seem as if it would be incredibly valid now, whether it's fear or anger. I mean, I think those emotions are probably being triggered a lot as a result of the situation. And actually, in Nussbaum's book, anger, that is exactly what she is recommending that people do as well. Before I ask you about philosophical counselling, which I think sort of could be very helpful for people to think about, in this book, your book, Live Like a Stoic, 52 exercises for cultivating a good life. I was looking at the week 42, which is Marcus Aurelius's Inner Citadel, and I did think the final section of it, if you don't mind me just reading that out, Marcus Aurelius's words, obviously. Foremost among the maxims to which you can bend your glance be these two. First, things cannot touch the soul, but stand without it stationary. Tumult can only arise from views within ourselves. Secondly, all things you see in a moment change and will be no more. Think of all the changes in which you have yourself borne part. The world is a moving shift. Life, a succession of views. And it seems to me that in that sort of very meditative view, the idea of impermanence, like you say, there is great similarities to Buddhism, but that could offer people some solace as well at the moment.
Yes, absolutely. So as you pointed out, there are two fundamental thoughts in that quote from Marcus Aurelius. The book, by the way, was co-written with my friend Greg Lopez, who is actually interested in yes, that's the one, who actually has a background in cognitive behavioral therapy. So it's not by chance.
That makes sense. Yeah. That makes complete sense.
Right. And in fact, if you look at the exercises in the book, each exercise starts with a quote from an ancient Stoic, and we sort of explain the philosophy through that quote. But then it goes into actual exercise, and the actual exercise is built on modern evidence from cognitive behavioral therapy and similar sort of research in psychology. So let's go back to that quote from Marcus Aurelius. So one of the things that he's saying there is that he's stressing is the impermanence of everything, and the other one is this notion that the value judgments are not inherent in things; they are human constructs; they're human created. So the first one should be, I think, pretty obvious. It's like, yes, everything is impermanent; nothing lasts, right? If you just think about it for a minute. The Stoics actually use this as in a series of meditations called sometimes referred to as the view from above. There is this notion that you try to zoom out either in space or in time and imagine that you're actually only one little thing on one little planet in one little solar system in one little galaxy and so on and so forth. That puts things in perspective a little bit. But also more importantly, I think temporally. Marcus does it often temporally. And he says, you're just a moment in time, and there is all of this stuff that is preoccupying you, all this stuff that is worrying you. It has happened countless times to other people before, and it will happen countless times to other people after. It's not that the universe is after you. You're not the only one with these kind of problems. And people have reacted and have managed or survived these kind of situations before. So, what makes you think that you're so special that, it's all about you? It's not. It's just keep a perspective. So keeping a perspective and reminding yourself that things always change. No matter how bad the situation is now, eventually it will pass. Of course, we will pass as well. We are not an exception to the universe, but that's a fact of life. So I think that does help. I actually do the meditation, the view from above meditation, on a regular basis, because it kind of, it's one of those things that at an intellectual level. But if you actually sit down and think about it more explicitly, I do it actually by way of imagery. I imagine, I turn it into a visual meditation. It actually helps emotionally because you kind of internalize it better. But the other point I think is really interesting and important, and it's really at the core of Stoicism. This is the notion that value judgments are not inherent in things. Things are not in themselves bad or good. We decide whether something is bad or good, and therefore it is up to us to decide which frame of reference, which framework we're going to use in order to think at some stuff. I'm going to give you a specific example in a minute, but one of the interesting things to me is that this is in fact a phenomenon that part of human psychology that has been now rediscovered by modern psychology. It's called the framing effect. And the framing effect is very powerful. We have empirical evidence about the fact that if you frame a situation to the same exact situation to people in very different ways, they will react differently. They will look at it very differently.
Yes.
Right?
So
for instance,
survival statistics as opposed to death statistics. I've been thinking about that. Every single thing is on a mortality rate rather than a survival without any harm rate. Yeah.
If you go to the doctor and the doctor says, you got 90% chances of surviving this, it's one thing. If it tells you, you got 10% chances of dying on this, it's a completely different thing. It's the same exact piece of information. It's not, the thing in itself hasn't changed, but the way it is presented to you will in fact affect you emotionally in a different manner. The Stoics understood this at a sort of intuitive level, and they used it a lot. In fact, you would think that much of Epictetus' philosophy is really based on the framing effect. So let me give you a standard example. So let's say you are, we started out this conversation with somebody going for a job interview. Well, now let's say that you've been laid off from your job. So you lost your job, be fine.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah, right? So, it does happen, right? Especially now. Or at least you don't know what's going to happen. And now you can look at it in a number of different ways. The obvious, the sort of the automatic way, because of the way we grew up and because of the way we are, shaped, our thoughts are shaped by our parents, our peers, and society at large, is that, oh my God, I lost my job, it's a catastrophe, right? That's the frame that we apply automatically. But that frame is not inherent in the situation. It's not, the situation itself is not a catastrophe or a good thing. It's a thing. It's a situation, right? There is this thing that can be described in entirely neutral language. Now, suppose you actually actively try to change your frame and say, okay, I could think of this as a catastrophe and get depressed and go to the bar and start drinking, that sort of stuff, which you can't do right now because bars are closed, right? Or you can say, hey, wait a minute. I can also see this as an opportunity. I can see this as a challenge. I can see that, okay, well, given that this is a situation and I can't do anything about the situation, what is it I can do? How can I retool myself? How can I apply my skills to another job or to another situation? Which is, from what you told me, is exactly what you're doing right now, right? So now that doesn't solve the problem. The situation still is you're currently without a job, but it changes dramatically, not only the way you feel about it, the way you think about it, and importantly, the way you act on it. Mm-hmm. Instead of, drinking yourself to death because you lost a job, you say, hey, let me work on things. What is it I can do in order to change the situation? A colleague of mine, a friend of mine, Bill Irvine, wrote an entire book recently about this.
Is that his resilience book? That
it's called The Stoic Challenge. The Stoic Challenge, and it's entirely based on the framing effect. And he recounts countless, instances, both that happened to him and that happened to other people. And one of my favorite is, so the trick that he uses mentally with himself is whenever he has a setback, instead of doing the obvious thing, reacting in the obvious ways, like, oh my gosh, this is a problem, he tells himself immediately, oh, here comes another challenge from the Stoic gods. And let's see how I'm doing. Now, he doesn't believe in Stoic gods. He doesn't think that there are Stoic gods, right? It's just a way he phrases things himself. And so he says, he thinks of it as a challenge. He says, okay, so this is I recognize it. This is a new challenge that the Stoic gods are sending me. So let me keep track of how I'm doing, right? So he literally takes it as a challenge until the end, until the situation is solved. He keeps track. He takes notes about how he's reacting and what he's doing and everything. So what does that do? First of all, it turns that into a game. Right? It's a serious game because the challenge, the setback can be serious, but it is a game. So your mind is occupied. You're not thinking about the catastrophe. You're thinking about, okay, how am I doing in answering this situation? And of course, by keeping scores, you are A, learning about yourself and your own reactions, which is going to be useful in the future. And B, actually have to think carefully about what you're going to do because you're writing it down. And so that helps you, in fact, focus on what it is that is actionable, what it is that you can do about it. And it's incredibly effective. I mean, as I said, there's pretty good research in modern psychology that shows the framing effect really does work.
I think there's a change in the hormonal levels as well, isn't there? If you regard something as a challenge or something as a crisis, something to do with, I can't remember if it's the balance of testosterone and cortisol or something, but
Yeah.
there does seem to be it does seem to be mapped in
Yes.
physiologically as
Yes.
well in the way that you
Yes.
think about something.
Because often people say things to me like, well, I can't control my emotions, right? They're like, oh, I just feel this way, or I just, it's nothing you can do about it. It's like, well, wait a minute, hold on. Because, so for the Stoics and for modern, again, importantly, for modern science, because just because the Stoics said it, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's true. But modern science does show you that there is no such thing as a sharp distinction between emotions and reason. That's the Platonic view of the mind, right? Plato famously said that the mind, the soul, he called it the soul. It's divided into these three areas, and then reason is supposed to be on top. He uses this wonderful metaphor, actually, of the charioteer, right? So the charioteer has these two horses, and the two horses are the appetitive and the emotive part of the soul, and the charioteer is reason. Reason is supposed to keep the horse in place. That's Plato. The Stoics say there is no distinction between reason and emotions. They're all one thing. They're all into one. There's only one mind. You don't have three souls. You only have one. And sure enough, modern science does tell you that our emotional responses are rooted in the amygdala, for instance, and our more cognitive responses are rooted in your frontal and parietal lobes. But it also shows, so there is an anatomic differentiation in the human brain in that respect. But it also shows that those areas are incredibly interconnected.
This is like Antonio Damasio's research.
Yes, right. Exactly. Antonio Damasio's books showed this very, very clearly. So they're so highly integrated. That's why, if you let it, sure, the amygdala can take over. If you let your fears or your hatred and so on and so forth take over, and you don't put any countermeasure in place, yes, they're going to take over, precisely because the amygdala is so intertwined with the frontal and parietal areas of your brain. But the same goes the other way around. Those frontal and parietal structures are also integrated in your amygdala, which is why you very much can affect your emotions by thinking rationally. You're thinking more sensibly about things. And so you're absolutely right. There are hormonal responses that are triggered by the framing effect. That means, again, I don't want to give the impression that there is a magic bullet there. It's not like you're afraid of something and all of a sudden it's like, oh, I shouldn't be afraid of it, and that's it, end of story, right? It doesn't work that way. But you need to train yourself, and the success rate is never 100%. You will still feel a little bit of fear, a little bit of anxiety, and things on so on and so forth, but it will get better.
And little shifts can help, and especially in this kind of moment. And I did want to give you the opportunity to talk about philosophical advice, because we have mentioned it once before on the podcast, talking to Daniel Finker, but it seemed to me that for a lot of people who might be wary for whatever reason of seeing a psychologist, or didn't feel that they particularly sort of fitted in with any therapeutic module, but wanted to talk about something that was specifically rated to a particular problem or a particular way of thinking that they had in their life, it seemed to me that it offered a really important extra niche for supporting people and helping people to think a little bit differently and about their lives in a way that could advantage them.
Yes. So philosophical counseling is, I think, complementary to psychological counseling in a sense, because of what I said earlier, which is philosophy is for life, psychotherapy is for specific problems. In fact, a colleague of mine here at the City College of New York, Lou Marinoff, wrote years ago a best-selling book about philosophical counseling called Plato, Not Prozac. And which is a wonderful title. Although that said, it does actually start, if you read the introduction in the book, he said, look, if you need Prozac or whatever other medication in order to bring your mind back to a normal range of functioning, you should do it. You should go to the psychiatrist or the psychologist and get help. But the fact of the matter is, once your mind is back to a more or less normal range of function, you're still going to have your problems. You still have to ask yourself, what am I doing in life? Should I be in this relationship? Should I be in this career? And so on and so forth. I mean, a pill isn't going to solve you with that problem. It's not going to tell you the answer to that problem. So Lou talks about philosophical counseling, as he puts it, as therapy for the sane, meaning that even when you don't have a pathology, even when you don't have, you're not depressed or you're not certainly schizophrenic or anything like that, or bipolar, even when you're perfectly, within the normal range of, mental behavior for a human being, you still have problems. You still have life to deal with. You still have to think about stuff. And so philosophical counseling helps in that way, and it can help either by itself or in conjunction with psychotherapy or even psychiatric therapy, depending on what the situation is. Because, as I said, those are not mutually exclusive. You can be clinically depressed. Well, the philosopher isn't going to be doing anything about that. It's not going to be helpful for that. You have to go to the psychotherapist. But that depression is not mutually exclusive with the fact that you might actually have serious actual problems.
Mm-hmm.
You might have been laid off, or your relationship of many years might have been ending in a bad way, and all that sort of stuff. And so you need a framework to think about those things, even after you recover from the bout of depression. So years ago, I signed up for with the American Philosophical Practitioners Association, the APPA. It's one of two major organizations in the United States that does that. I know there is a major one also in the UK.
Oh, okay.
And so what you do is you get certified. You do a short course. You have to have a degree in philosophy, so at least a master's degree, preferably a PhD in philosophy, and you do these course where you basically taught the basics of counseling, because of course just because you have a PhD in philosophy, that doesn't mean you know how to counsel people, and then you do that. Actually, the certification is renewed every few years, so you have to do updates and things like that. And then I started my practice, and it's not my major job. I mean, my major job is a university professor, and now actually increasingly as an author of books, but certainly not as a counselor. But I like it. I like to do it because it's yet another way in which I feel helpful to people. Right? One of the major things that really changed in my life when I embraced Stoicism is that up to that point, I was your standard academic. And you're standard academic, and there's nothing wrong with being a standard academic, in a sense. Not only I was for most of my part, but I still am in a sense. But a standard academic does what? Well, you spend your time reading and writing about stuff that is very technical, very specific, and it's probably be read by a few dozen people or a few hundred people in the world. And it's not going to make a change, a difference in people's lives, which is fine. This we need academic research, we need scholarship. It's an interesting thing. But as soon as I started writing about Stoicism, after my first book came out, How to Be a Stoic, it's like, holy cow, I got hundreds of people writing to me and saying, wow, ranging from this literally changed my life to, this is very helpful. I was going through a hard period on my life, and this is actually helping me cope with it, and that sort of stuff. So you feel like what you're doing is not your practice is not just for yourself. You're actually being helpful to other people. And that's a good feeling. That the Stoics wouldn't be surprised, right? If you become pro-social, that's a good feeling. That's a good thing. Doing philosophical counseling is another way of doing that. It's more personal because it's one-on-one. You don't write books for large number of people, or you don't give lectures to a large number of people. It's a one-on-one thing. And as such, however, it becomes more intimate, and you get to know the person a lot better, right? I mean, I have readers of my books or people who listen to podcasts like this one and write an email to me, and then maybe we exchange a couple of emails, and you get a sense of how you were helpful. But in the case of a client who does several sessions of philosophical counseling with you, you really get to know the person much better, and you really need to you get to provide more detailed advice and more detailed feedback. And it feels good. It's just a good thing. It's helpful to people, and so I hope to keep doing it so long as it is helpful to people.
Well, I'm mindful of your time, and that seems a good place to end, unless there is anything, Massimo, that you particularly wanted to bring up, either about the work that you're doing or about encouragement to people in testing times.
No, I think we covered quite a bit of territory. I think there are resources out there. My book, other people's books. Bill Irvine, Donald Robertson has written a couple of good books about one, especially specifically about Stoicism and cognitive behavioral therapy. So there are resources out there, and we are in a crisis now. It's time to reach out for those resources. I mean, after all, what else you got to do? You have to be home anyway, so you might as well pass your time in a way that it's good for the rest of your life.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Massimo Pigliucci, for being on Shrink Wrap Radio.
It was a pleasure. Thank you for having me.